I wonder sometimes if the Conservative Party of Canada might be actually missing a large segment of the population that very well may vote Conservative, but are turned off by the Conservative Party's kind of one dimensional stance when it comes to the Israel Palestine war. You know, uh, Pierre Poilievre has openly said repeatedly that he supports Israel, and it's almost like a blinding support. Poilievre says he believes in a negotiated two-state solution, but the conservative government would stand up for Israel's right to defend itself and would reject any motion or resolution at the UN that it believes unfairly targets Israel. And Poilievre has openly discussed his willingness to support Israel. This was shared by Mahmoud Moura on Instagram. Now, I don't know if this is official Conservative Party language because there's nothing here that indicates it. But here's a pamphlet that was shared, and it says, "Support Israel, vote conservative." And on the back end, it says, "God promised the land of Palestine to the Jewish people. On October 7th, Palestinian terrorists brutally raped and murdered seniors, women, and children. Only one party has been unconditional in their support for the innocent victims and Israel. Only one party has committed itself to moving the Canadian embassy to the true capital of Israel, Jerusalem. Support your local conservative candidate who shares these values of a strong democratic Israel." Now, again, I don't know if this is actually Conservative Party of Canada pamphlets. There's no Conservative Party logo on it, but it's not fully aligned, but it does kind of align with everything we've heard from Poilievre about support for Israel. I will say that there's, again, large segments of the population who very well don't agree with this full on support for Israel. And it's not because they support Hamas. It's because I think a lot of Canadians just don't want to get involved in international conflicts right now. With inflation and interest rates so high and the cost of living so high in Canada, I think, to be honest, most Canadians, similar to Americans back, during the Iraq War and other wars, they're thinking like, man, we're going to spend billions of dollars here. We have issues at home. They're serious. People can't afford the cost of living. Cost of living in our cities are getting high. People are going to food banks in record numbers. Middle class families are going to food banks. The idea of home ownership is now not only a dream for some, it's like an unattainable dream for so many. Um, it's real, and I think Canadians are maybe asking their leaders to take a less, strong stance on this Israel-Palestine conflict, recognizing the complexity of it. I think the other thing is the Conservatives may be underestimating the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. So this was a movement, BDS. It was a movement back in 2005. It's still relevant today, which pressures companies to boycott, divest, and sanction and engage in sanctions against Israel. It's Palestinian led, started in 2005, and it's to calls for Israel to end its occupation in the West Bank, recognizing the rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. There has been criticism that this movement is anti-Semitic. It's very anti-Israel, which bleeds into promoting anti-Semitic rhetoric for some at the extreme ends. And this goes all the way back to the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, which drew parallels between the Israeli and South African apartheid. Very interesting, because you'd think that the BDS movement is a quote unquote fringe movement that only students and a few people would be interested in this, or student led movements would be the only ones. But interestingly enough, the BDS movement over the years have actually led to divestments happening, which is quite interesting. That the power of naming and shaming is real. So companies like French multinationals, Veolia, divested, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, divested from the Israeli market, selling off interests in light railway projects. In 2015, French multinational Orange, the telecommunication company, terminated its licensing agreement based on the BDS campaign. Dutch pension giant PGGM withdrew all its investments from Israel's 5 largest banks because of their West Bank, because of what was happening in the West Bank. This is in 2014. And then there's also, the Norwegian government pension fund, one of the largest sovereign wealth funds, has excluded 2 Israeli companies from construction, involved in the construction in the West Bank. New Zealand's superannuation fund excludes 3 Israeli companies from its investment portfolio over their involvement in constructing Israeli settlements or providing services in the occupied territories. These are real. These are so real that the United States government back in the 1970s, I believe, actually put forward an anti-BDS law, which is interesting because BDS came on later, but it was the Export Administration Act of 1979. And again, if we think that, the United States government isn't in tune with this, they very well are. And the overall argument here is that the United States government is very much concerned with the BDS movement, and that they want to make sure that that the government understands that this is a movement that has serious implications. Between the years 1946, this is an interesting stat. Between the years 1946 to now, the United States government has provided nearly $300 billion in aid to Israel. A lot of that being military aid. That's a lot of money, and they recognize the impact BDS can have for companies wanting to do business in Israel. And so that is real. That's a real sentiment. So I don't think that the conservatives in Canada fully understand what Canadians writ large are thinking about Israel. Here's a perfect example. This is from Politico. Now, I don't know how accurate this is. This was a survey conducted in October of 2023 amongst 1,500 roughly Canadians. I want to scroll down. Conservatives are split on whether to support Israel. Let me zoom in for you. Percent of people who agree or disagree that Canada should support Israel against Hamas by political party. Now, isn't that interesting? For so many, you'd assume majority of liberals agree, but look at conservatives. 44% agree that Canada should support Israel on Hamas. Sorry, my apologies. I thought for sure you'd see the majority of liberals disagreeing. 39% of conservatives disagree that Canada should support Israel against Hamas. Now, again, 1,500 Canadians, not sure if this is fully statistically relevant, but still very interesting that only 44% actually agree in that sample size. But I would actually extrapolate that further, that this could actually become an issue for Poilivere. And the reason why is because Poilivere, again, has taken such a hard stance against Israel, in favor of Israel. And I think Poilivere is missing the real issue here. Again, Canadians are more concerned with their domestic needs than they are international needs. And I think most Canadians recognize the complexity of Israel-Palestine. Why should Canada get involved in that? Instead, we have real issues here at home. So, role-playing, if I were conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, I would say something like, listen, I understand completely that many Canadians have varying opinions on what's happening out in Israel and Palestine, the current conflict. I want you to know that we 100% are against any type of targeted attack towards civilians on both sides. And we're going to use our diplomatic pressure to work with all sides on this conflict to reach as much a peaceful solution as possible. But I also recognize that Canadians have real concerns right now here at home. And the cost of living and housing and making sure that middle-class families and low-income families have the adequate resources to send their kids to school, to save for retirement, to make sure they have enough to help their kids with, a down payment, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the top priorities and concerns. I think that may strike some level of balance because I think even people on both sides of the spectrum when it comes to the Israel-Palestine war can understand why the prime minister is taking a much more domestic, I hate to say Canada first approach, sounds like Trump, but I do think that actually is the better approach here. If you do take the side of Israel, you paint yourself into a box, and I think you miss so many moderate Canadians who are definitely not voting Trudeau in October, but who are listening to you support Israel almost unanimously and not listening to the real concerns that are out there about the IDF and its treatment towards children and its targeting of children in particular, hospitals, schools, etc. Those are real. Those are real. International communities are coming out against, some international countries are coming out against them, as well as the protests across the world are real. BDS movement is real. It has real impacts. So I think the conservatives should actually take note of this, read the tree leaves or tea leaves, whatever that saying is. I've never gotten that right, but take a more nuanced approach to the Israel-Palestine war. It is not nearly as black and white as we'd like to believe. There are much bigger issues here at home, and that is a much better approach, I think, in the Israel-Palestine war. I read somewhere that you don't always have to have an opinion on things, and I kind of agree with that. I mean, I do think that you should have opinions on things, but when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, again, Polyev, if you're thinking from a political strategic lens, over the summer months and then even next year, spring and summer, you're going to be going out to many different communities across Canada, knocking on doors, getting people to vote for conservatives. There are many communities who do not, many Canadians who want you to take a more nuanced stance on Israel. And because they don't see themselves in your policies, particularly on that, people might do a protest vote. And nobody wants to see that, but people very well may say, you know what, I'm definitely not voting Trudeau. I'm not really enamored by the conservatives, but now they have this very hard stance about Israel-Palestine, and I may no longer vote conservative because there could be like a dark horse in the race. I'm not saying Jagmeet Singh could be it or the Bloc, but the PPC, there could be some type of more moderate stance specifically on the Israel-Palestine war that another party could take. And again, that siphons votes away from the conservatives. So just thinking, there is a better approach to addressing the Israel-Palestine war. I don't think a polarizing view is the best, especially if you're trying to get elected, especially when so many people have very nuanced perspectives on the conflict itself. But what do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. Do you think that this is a smart strategy for the conservatives to think about?